I know you. You're that jaywalking punk anarchist.
Hello, this is the Radical Reviewer.
And JT from Second Thought.
And we're taking a look at The End of Policing by Alex Vitale, Verse Publishing, 2018. The key idea of this text is that many of our societal problems that are currently being addressed by the police, protection from violence, mental health intervention, homelessness, the war on drugs, civil unrest, etc., are not being solved and are often being made worse by the police. The text argues that the solution is not to reform how the police handle these various societal problems, but to remove the police as solutions to these problems altogether. In other words, an end to policing. Or at least that's how I see it. What do you think, Second Thought?
Yep, that sounds about right. The mainstream conversation around policing generally begins and ends with reform. The idea that police could be done away with entirely, or even just have their jurisdiction curtailed a bit, is never considered. Most people assume that police abolitionism is just a knee-jerk reaction to the recent police brutality issues, but that's not actually the case. Abolitionism has a rich history, and it's something we really do need to talk about.
Oh, absolutely. These aren't exactly new ideas, even though people act like it. It goes the same for prison abolitionism. For example, that 2003 book, Are Prisons Obsolete by Angela Davis.
Hey, excuse me. I'm just doing some patrols in the area. Do you happen to live at this residence?
Hello, officer. I'm not sure what you're looking for, but are you detaining me or am I free to go?
Excuse me? No reason to get all hostile. Do you have something to hide? Let me see some ID.
Officer, I'm not in a motor vehicle. I don't have to show you any ID, but I can give you my legal name, which is Reviewer, Radical Reviewer.
Uh-huh, I see. Well, this is a frequent drug dealing spot, and your recalcitrant attitude seems pretty suspicious to me. Can you please turn out your pockets? I want to make sure you aren't holding any drugs or illegal paraphernalia.
Pockets? Officer, I do not consent to searches. Are you detaining me or am I free to go?
I see. A real wise guy. You want to do this the hard way? Let's do it the hard way. I'm taking you in for some questioning.
I probably should have downloaded the ACLU Mobile Justice app so that I could have filmed this interaction for my own protection. Alright, let's go.
Alright, Radical Reviewer, what were you doing on that porch? Waiting to pick up or deliver some drugs? Or maybe you were working as a lookout?
Now, normally I would simply tell you I'm going to remain silent, I'd like to see a lawyer, but since I was in the middle of starting a review of The End of Policing, I think I'll just pick up where I left off and tell you all about Chapter 1, The Limits of Police Reform.
Now what's all this about?
No, hear me out. I think you might find this interesting. You see, the text starts by naming several of the more famous incidents of police murdering civilians, Tamir Rice, Eric Gardner, and others, and Vitale explains that these more well-known examples fail to give us the true scope of murders by the police because the number and nature of these murders is not reported. And despite a 2006 law requiring the reporting of this information, reauthorized in 2014, many police departments do not comply.
Well, you see, it's a dangerous world out there. We are the thin blue line between civility and chaos.
Well, that mindset is just it. Vitale then discusses books like Crime and Human Nature and The Bell Curve, and the conservative shift in how we view race and crime in the US, leading us to this concept called broken windows policing. Now, broken windows policing is basically the idea that ignoring small infractions paves the way for larger crimes. If a building has a broken window, people might think it's safe to graffiti. If it's got broken windows and graffiti, it might be a safe place to squat in or set up a tent outside of without being harassed. If the building has all broken windows and graffiti and a homeless encampment around it, it might be a safe place to deal drugs or sell sex work. And if people are selling drugs and sex work, it might be the perfect place for a mugging, or to sexually assault someone, or murder someone. And now, you've got a modern Sodom on your hands. All because you ignored a broken window. So the game plan is to bust people for petty crimes. Graffiti, littering, loitering, drug possession, panhandling, walking while black, and stuff like that. And then you avoid the slippery slope that leads you to some kind of Gotham City, but where every alley is Crime Alley Hellworld. Vitale defines Broken Window's policing as a deeply conservative attempt to shift the burden of responsibility for declining living conditions onto the poor themselves, and to argue that the solution to all societal ills is increasingly aggressive, invasive, and restrictive forms of policing that involve more arrests, more harassment, and ultimately more violence. Reforms. Now, there is a solution to all this. Officers just need more training. Well, not quite. Use of force training doesn't really seem to be working when officers ignore a suspect crying, "I can't breathe." More than this, Vitale argues that training is often part of the problem itself, since private training courses involve combat training and warrior training, which frame policing in terms of us versus them, hero versus villain.
A whole sub-industry of police training has also cropped up to reinforce the message that cops are at war. And perhaps no one takes that idea further than this guy.
Once you've made the decision to take a human life, you're a transformed creature, you're a predator. What does a predator do? They kill. Only a killer can hunt a killer. Are you emotionally, spiritually, psychologically prepared to snuff out a human life in defense of innocent lives? If you can't make that decision, you need to find another job.
Wait, how did you do that?
What?
With the video clip just now, how did you do that?
Well, I mean, this whole arrest thing is just a framing device in a script that I wrote. I can do whatever I want.
What? Script? Framing device?
Don't worry about it. Let's keep going. The problem is not simply bias or sensitivity training. The problem is systemic. Vitale states, well-trained police, following proper procedure, are still going to be arresting people for mostly low-level offenses, and the burden will continue to fall primarily on communities of color, because that is how the system is designed to operate. Basically, additional training does nothing for the fact that certain neighborhoods are over-policed, thus leading to a higher probability of stops, thus higher probability of arrests, and higher probability of violent interactions with the police. Okay, so more training isn't enough. What about this community policing that folks keep talking about? Well, Vitale explains that this concept of community policing, though a positive one, often flies in the face of policing as an institution. He states, when their job is to criminalize all disorderly behavior and fund local governments through massive ticketing writing campaigns, their interactions with the public in high crime areas will be at best gruff and distant, and at worst, hostile and abusive. Next, Vitale describes how accountability is a major problem with modern policing, because federal oversight is ignored or ineffective for addressing fairly autonomous local police departments. And at the local level, prosecutors can't hold police to account because they often work hand in hand with the police. So, go figure, it's hard to police the police. Alternatives. Vitale explains that the origins and function of the police are intimately tied to the management of inequalities of race and class, the suppression of workers, and the tight surveillance and micromanagement of black and brown lives have always been at the center of policing. Any police reform strategy that does not address this reality is doomed to fail. Something tells me this sentiment will be at the root of the alternatives to policing discussed in the chapters ahead. But this is where second thought was going to come in. So, officer, could I please make my phone call?
Yeah, make it snappy.
Hey, second thought. Sorry about this, having to call you from a police station and all that to continue the review, but it is what it is. You think you could tell me about Chapter 2?
Sure. Did you get arrested? We can reschedule this book review if you want. I don't want to get you in any more trouble.
Yeah, I think I'll be okay, but given my current predicament, I think I'd definitely benefit from hearing about Chapter 2.
Okay, if you're sure. Well, in that case, Chapter 2 is titled, The Police Are Not Here to Protect You. Vitale starts off by saying liberals think of the police as the legitimate mechanism for using force in the interest of the whole society. The police must maintain their public legitimacy by acting in a way that the public respects and is in keeping with the rule of law. For liberals, police reform is always a question of taking steps to restore that legitimacy. He goes on to say, what is missing from this liberal approach is any critical assessment of what problems the state is asking the police to solve, and whether the police are really the best suited to solve them. That's really the crux of the matter. It seems like more and more often we're seeing the police used as a default solution to all sorts of different problems, often with disastrous consequences. To understand why this is the case, we need to understand the original role of the police. Vitale explains that the first modern police force was created in England in 1829 by Sir Robert Peel, who developed the idea while managing British colonial occupation of Ireland. Peel developed the London Metropolitan Police, which worked to enforce vagrancy laws, protect private property, stop riots, put down strikes, and otherwise quell civil unrest during the Industrial Revolution. The London model was soon adopted in the United States. In both countries, the police were used as a cudgel to keep the people in line and suppress unwanted political activity and activism, a trend that continues to this day. Vitale says, America's early urban police were both corrupt and incompetent. Officers were usually chosen based on political connections and bribery. There were no civil service exams or even formal training in most places. They were also used as a tool of political parties to suppress opposition voting and spy on and suppress workers' organizations, meetings, and strikes. Vitale explains that the US government also created private police to deal with strikes, such as the Coal and Iron Police. These forces worked as strikebreakers and agent provocateurs. And more than this, Vitale states, the Coal and Iron Police committed numerous atrocities, including the Latimer Massacre of 1897, in which they killed 19 unarmed miners and wounded 32 others. In the end, political leaders and employers decided that a new system of labor management paid for out of the public coffers would be cheaper for them and have greater public legitimacy and effectiveness. This led to the creation of the first state police in 1905. Other inspirations for modern US policing included colonial policing in Central America and the Caribbean, the Texas Rangers, not the baseball team, and the slave patrols and racist policing in the post-slavery era. For example, Vitale writes, new laws outlawing vagrancy were used extensively to force blacks to accept employment. Sheriffs and judges also received kickbacks and in some cases generated lists of fit and hardworking blacks to be incarcerated on behalf of employers, who would then lease them out to perform forced labor for profit. One of the most important things to take away from this chapter is the intended purpose of implementing a civilian police force. Vitale says, the transition from the use of militias and military troops to civilian police was a process of engineering greater public acceptance of the social control functions of the state, whether abroad or at home. This is critical to understand. Just like the media is used to manufacture our consent for military action and corporate domination around the world, separating the military and police into two separate entities served the dual purpose of isolating the US population from understanding the brutality of the military and keeping us in line with a seemingly friendly, though in reality completely adversarial, civilian police force. Vitale wraps up the chapter with a proposal, recognizing that the police are not a good solution for many of society's challenges. He says, instead of asking the police to solve our problems, we must organize for real justice. We need to produce a society designed to meet people's human needs rather than wallow in the pursuit of wealth at the expense of all else.
Okay, cool. So colonial occupation, slave patrols, and worker suppression is where our modern concept of policing comes from and greatly influences policing today. That's good to know. Hey, while I have you here, before they kick me off the phone, let me tell you about Chapter 3. The school-to-prison pipeline. Vitale starts by explaining that a huge factor in the school-to-prison pipeline has been the advent of the SRO, School Resource Officers, the police officers that patrol inside our schools. Apparently, over 40% of our schools now have police officers assigned to them. Now, police in our schools might seem normal these days, like you wouldn't even question it, but that wasn't always the case. So what changed? Vitale explains that there are three main factors leading to the increase in school policing. The super predator myth, that being the belief that some gangster rap enjoying, baggy pants wearing inner city youths are involved in violent gang activity. School shootings, that being the increase in school shootings in recent years. And increased testing, that being an increase in standardized tests and teaching to the test, pushed by policies such as No Child Left Behind, which tied school funding to test scores. Now, the super predator myth and school shooting reasons kind of make sense. Increased violence in schools, send in the police. But what does testing have to do with this? Vitale explains, a teacher or administrator who wants to keep their job or earn a bonus has an incentive to get rid of students who are dragging down test scores through low performance or behaviors. Basically, a vicious cycle is formed. Teaching to the test is rote and boring, so students act out. There's then motivation to remove these students from the test-taking pool so they don't bring down test scores. Consequently, these students aren't feeling valued, they aren't receiving proper motivation or engagement with their education, so they act out more. And then, well, it's time to send in the police. And, of course, an increase in school policing leads to an increase in the problems that come with over-policing. And Vitale lists several incidents of school resource officers assaulting, handcuffing, arresting, pepper spraying, tear gassing, and tasing students. Reforms. In response to criticism, schools have tried to expand and soften police involvement, almost a community policing type approach, which, as discussed in Chapter 1, is incompatible with the role of police in society. You can't exactly have a school resource officer be some kind of friendly guidance counselor on the one paw when his role is to arrest students for drug possession or fighting on the other. Alternatives. What is needed is restorative justice, social and emotional alternatives, and to remove the police from our schools. Vitale states, what is needed but often not supplied by school officials is a set of non-punitive disciplinary measures designed to keep kids in school while getting to the root of disruptive behavior. And Vitale concludes, we must find better ways to keep kids safe than turning their schools into armed fortresses and prisons. Our young people need compassion and care, not coercion and control.
Hey, hurry up in there. We don't have all day.
Yeah, 1 second. Second thought, I gotta get back to the interrogation room and try and get this whole situation sorted out, but in the meantime, would you mind telling our viewer about the next chapter?
Chapter 4. We called for help and they killed my son. Yeah, this chapter is hard to read. The amount of pain and suffering inflicted on people by the police is truly staggering. We're all familiar with instances of cops killing people for suspected crimes, or because they supposedly feared for their lives, or some other nonsense reason. But more and more often, we're hearing stories of police being called to handle mental health episodes, often ending in the death of a person who needs actual mental health care, not some guy with a gun. Vitale says, one of the most tragic developments in policing in the last 40 years has been the massive expansion of their role in managing people with mental illness and other psychiatric disabilities. It's not hard to see why this has happened. Vitale notes that the US has terrible mental health care services, and to make matters worse, very few people can afford them, making mental health resources nearly inaccessible to much of the population. So, without having any actual solutions available, people have to rely on calling 911 when someone is experiencing a mental health crisis. And more often than not, it's the cops who show up, and they're always a little too eager to use force. Vitale then gives some statistics comparing the US to other countries. Here in the States, police kill hundreds of people with mental illness every year. One estimate states that 1 out of every 4 people killed by police has some form of mental illness. By comparison, in the UK, where police are less heavily armed, officers are far more likely to resolve the situation without deadly force. Vitale says, what we are witnessing is, in essence, the criminalization of mental illness, with police on the front lines of this process. As with many issues, it's easier to simply keep doing things the way we've always done them. Why build new mental health infrastructure when we can just keep sending out cops to fix the situation? The thing is, the way we currently handle mental health issues is incredibly inefficient and counterproductive. Vitale explains, the cost of housing people and providing them with mental health services is actually lower than cycling them through emergency rooms, homeless shelters, and jails. Great, so we're switching to a new model immediately, right? Well, no. It's hard to build the momentum to make big changes, especially to institutions like the police, which are a particularly politicized issue. That being said, there have been some attempts at reform. Vitale explains that although there have been efforts to improve police training regarding their interactions with people with mental illness, providing outreach teams and mental health courts, these reforms don't go far enough. For example, officers still won't be able to make a meaningful clinical assessment in the field. And although courts may help people access resources, if they fail to meet guidelines, they can be punished, lose those resources, or even receive jail time. It's clear that we have a long way to go if we're going to fix the police and our mental health infrastructure. And moving away from the American police mindset, immediately apply force, is a necessary step. Vitale explains, instead of relying on forced treatment, we should be providing easy access to varied, culturally appropriate, community-based services as needed. and that trained civilian responders should be the default preference. A well-trained team is much less likely to cause a death than an armed police officer.
Think second thought.
Who are you talking to?
Don't worry about it.
Alright, well, Radical Reviewer, you're clean, and mostly we need this room for something else, so you're free to go.
That's awesome. But actually, before I go, let me tell you about Chapter 5, Criminalizing Homelessness. Vitale starts by explaining that the first state homeless shelters were in the basements of police stations, this being the beginning of making the police the arm of government in the role of dealing with the homeless. And Vitale then discusses the effects of this, namely police destroying homeless people's property and assaulting and even killing homeless people in altercations.
Now listen here, I don't like cleaning out a homeless encampment any more than the next guy, but people can't live like that. It's not safe or sanitary. We have to do something.
Well, that's just the thing. Vitale argues that constantly arresting and rearresting homeless people for various offenses, loitering, trespassing, disorderly conduct, or whatever, will not alter their future behavior or reduce their impact on the community. Now, you probably already knew that, but what's interesting here is the ways in which criminalization of the homeless is often in violation of the law itself. Numerous panhandling ordinances have been found unconstitutional because they violate the First Amendment right to freedom of speech. Cities often run into legal trouble when they sweep out encampments and in the process destroy people's possessions. The DOJ issued a legal opinion in 2015 that many of the anti-sleeping and camping statutes being enforced across the country may be illegal. The criminalization of homeless people also violates the International Covenant Against Torture and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. And international human rights law also gives people the right to freedom of movement. Statutes that attempt to restrict homeless people's access to certain areas through loitering laws and probation conditions that restrict access to certain areas may violate this. Okay, so the way that we currently police the homeless is ineffective, and it's harmful to the belongings and lives of homeless people. And potentially, it's totally illegal. So what do we do now? Reforms. The police have created specialized outreach teams, trained to de-escalate situations with homeless persons and offer access to services and things like that. Also, homeless courts have been developed to help connect people with vital services. However, much like the mental health courts in the previous chapter, Vitale states, such programs rarely create significant new services. They instead try to obtain set-asides from existing programs, taking slots away from those who might obtain them through shelter caseworkers or other social service providers. Alternatives. Vitale argues that some solutions include higher pay for entry-level work, increased affordable housing, and improved support services. He primarily recommends the Housing First approach, which provides immediate permanent housing to the homeless. He states, we need to give people a place to be that helps them stabilize their situation and reduce their impact on surrounding communities. The best way to do this is through a system of drop-in centers and emergency shelters, focused on getting people off the streets without relying on police, the criminal justice system, or other punitive mechanisms. These solutions will do far more and at far less cost to taxpayers than relying on the police. As Vitale stated earlier in the chapter, a study by the University of New Mexico documented that providing people with housing reduced jail costs by 64%. Anyway, that's all I have for you, officer. Thanks for wasting my time and tax dollars. I guess I will take the bus home now. In the meantime, take it away, second thought.
Glad you're finally out of there. Please try not to get arrested again on the way home. Vitale starts chapter 6 by explaining, when we allow police to regulate our sexual lives, we inflict tremendous harm on some of the most vulnerable people in our society. Young people, poor women, and transgendered persons who rely on the sex industry to survive and even thrive are forced by police into the shadows, leaving them vulnerable to abuse, exploitation, and diminished health outcomes. Today, most objections to sex work come from outdated notions of morality, parents fear their children will be exposed to the existence of sexual activity, and sometimes genuine concern for the well-being of the sex workers themselves. You might be surprised to learn that America actually had plenty of overt red light districts in the early 20th century. Vitale gives a brief history of the criminalization of sex work, starting in the 1910s, where many American cities had red light districts where sex work was decriminalized. When World War I rolled around, sex work was restricted in an attempt to limit the spread of sexually transmitted diseases among soldiers, and then restricted further during the Progressive Era, which emphasized a supposed restoration of morality to the cities. Over the years, police action against sex work has become more and more aggressive. Today, undercover cops will solicit sex workers, then arrest them and try to extract information about the existence of covert brothels or other sex workers. In areas with a history of prostitution, quote, suggestive clothing or transgender appearance are deemed sufficient evidence to arrest people on the spot. While this may seem to indicate that the police are trying to destroy sex work, Vitale says policing has aimed not to eradicate prostitution, but to drive it underground. This process leaves these workers without a means to complain when they are raped, beaten, or otherwise victimized. It strengthens the hands of pimps and traffickers and contributes to unsafe sex practices. Well, that seems a little strange, right? Why would the police do that? Well, Vitale goes on to explain, in just the last few years, American police have been implicated in running and providing protection for brothels, demanding sex from prostitutes to avoid arrest, hiring underage prostitutes, acting as pimps, stealing from and assaulting sex workers, and demanding bribes from prostitutes and their clients. There is no way to know the full extent of these practices, but the problem is widespread and ongoing. There's your answer: widespread corruption and abuse of power. In other words, police doing what they do best. Vitale then discusses various reforms, such as those implemented in Nevada, San Francisco, Germany, Belgium, the Netherlands, Sweden, and New Zealand. He comes to the unsurprising conclusion that when you take policing out of the equation, the problems go away. He ends the chapter by saying, allowing and regulating sex work reduces harm to sex workers, their clients, and communities, with very little role for the police. The subordinate position of women in our economy and culture is the real harm left unaddressed by prohibition. Despite the lofty goals of abolitionists, as long as they are denied equal economic and political rights and equal pay for equal work, women will be forced into marginal forms of employment.
Chapter 7: The War on Drugs. Well, this seems relevant to the kerfuffle I just experienced with the police. Luckily, my scripted scenario with fake police went much easier than most actual political interactions of that nature, but let's get back to the text. Vitale starts the chapter arguing that the war on drugs is the most damaging and ineffective form of policing facing us. There is no evidence that our country's drug problems have been improved by driving millions into prison. Vitale then provides a history of drug prohibition, criminalization of opium to target Chinese immigrants in the late 19th and early 20th century, criminalization of cocaine and marijuana to target blacks and Hispanics and hippies during the civil rights movement and anti-war movement in the mid and late 20th century, and the modern crackdown on, well, crack. And Vitale, of course, uses that famous John Ehrlichman quote, Nixon's chief domestic policy advisor, you know, that famous quote regarding the war on drugs. You know the one.
So now here's Ehrlichman in his own words. He says, the Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies.
The anti-war left and black people. You understand what I'm saying? We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black.
But by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily,
we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news.
Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did.
Vitale then discusses the role corruption plays in prohibition. For example, police being arrested for burglarizing evidence rooms for drugs, police arrested for trying to sell drugs, police arrested for smuggling drugs, and even police arrested for extorting people into manufacturing drugs. Okay, so prohibition isn't helped when the police want to stick their greedy little hands in the cookie jar. But what about when things go as planned, when drugs are policed according to the law? Well, Vitale explains that most drug enforcement is in clear violation of our Fourth Amendment rights. Stops and searches, tapping phones, false or misuse of search warrants, and in some cases, police getting old arrest records and searching properties where drugs had previously been found, even if totally different, unrelated people were now living there. Reforms. Discussing drug courts, Vitale states, drug courts meld together punitive and therapeutic approaches in very counterproductive ways that extend rather than reduce the role of the criminal justice system in the lives of drug users. Basically, similar to the mental health courts and the homeless courts discussed in previous chapters, these alternatives are grossly ineffective at best and actively harmful at worst. Vitale then discusses various decriminalization efforts taking place in places like Colorado, Portugal, and now Oregon and such. But he argues that any effort which still involves heavy reliance on the police will not have fully resolved the problem. Alternatives. Vitale states, we must create robust public health programs and economic development strategies to reduce demand and help people manage their drug problems in ways that reduce harm, while keeping in mind that most drug users are not addicts. And Vitale proposes harm reduction, needle exchanges, supervised injection, treatment on demand, and improving public drug education and legalization policies to address this. But the biggest solution to the war on drugs is in regards to economic opportunities. Vitale argues that many people involved in the drug industry don't really have a drug problem, they have a job problem. He further argues that strict prohibition, forced treatment, and other policies have failed because none of them address the underlying economic root of the problem. And he's not wrong. Perhaps you know folks like this in your own life, but for me, I have several friends and family members who have done several types of drugs to several different degrees, and those with drug addiction problems have unstable housing, unhealthy relationships, they're self-medicating, and they're facing all these other factors that are tied to, well, a lack of a decent job with good benefits, thus restricting their access to therapy and prescription drugs and economic independence. On the other paw, friends and family who would occasionally dabble in drugs, cocaine at a party or shrooms on a camping trip or whatever, those folks typically had, well, stable homes, stable jobs, a therapist, and if they needed medication for bipolar or anxiety or whatever, that was covered through their insurance and not part of their recreational self-medication. You know, go figure. And Vitale concludes, the history of American wealth generation is a history of the exploitation of black people, from slavery to the present. That past cannot be ignored in any effort to come to terms with inequality. Some of the resources for overcoming that legacy could come from the billions we now spend on fighting the drug war, and the taxes we could collect from legalized drugs. Chapter 8, Gang Suppression. Vitale starts by explaining the history of gang policing, for example, the creation of police gang units in the 80s and 90s. Next, he explains that the police do not actually understand how gangs operate, and they make basic mistakes, like assuming that most illegal youth activity is gang-related, when it isn't, assuming that people are in gangs for life, when most are only involved for a year or two, assuming that gangs have a strict hierarchy with a leader at the top, when in fact gangs are very horizontal in structure, and assuming that arrests will help reduce gang involvement or criminality, when they don't. Vitale then discusses gang databases, these like extensive lists of gang members and gang-affiliated people. Apparently, it's incredibly easy to get yourself onto a gang database, especially with social media, where even just knowing someone who's suspected of being in a gang gets you on the list yourself. And then, if you are charged with a crime, being on this very easy to get on list will land you with a longer sentence. Alright, now we do a similar song and dance as the previous chapters. We have this problem: violent gang activity. Now, historically, police have been unhelpful in solving this problem and have been actively making it worse. So we're going to look at reforms, followed by the true alternative. My money is on removing police from the equation. Let's have a look. Reforms. The two main reforms Vitale discusses are the Spurgle model, and focused deterrence. These involve collaboration between law enforcement, schools, social service providers, and local communities. In the end, the reforms fall short. Vitale states, most young people who engage in serious crime are already living in harsh and dangerous circumstances. They need stability, positive guidance, and real pathways out of poverty. In the end, focused deterrence is really a continuation of the punitive practices already employed. Alternatives. Vitale argues that we need to seriously address racialized poverty in highly segregated neighborhoods. We need to improve stability for people growing up in crushing poverty and violence. We need to empower communities to be able to solve these problems on their own, perhaps working alongside the government, rather than, well, being policed by it. And Vitale concludes, without community-level changes in employment opportunities, adequate social services for young people with serious life problems, and improved educational structures, no one program can end the violence. There must be a holistic approach that begins by reducing our reliance on the criminal justice system and building political power to demand more comprehensive and less punitive solutions. Back to you, Second Thought.
Chapter 9 is all about border policing, something I am very familiar with living in Texas. Vitale starts the chapter with a history of border policing, and argues that our borders were essentially open until the incredibly racist Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. Since then, we've piled on more and more exceptions, including the infamous 1924 National Origins Act, which established nationality-based immigration quotas and gave birth to the U.S. Border Patrol. If you know anything about the U.S., you won't be surprised to hear Vitale's take on the purpose of border law. He says, U.S. border enforcement has been primarily about the production of whiteness and economic inequality. Since the very beginning, our border policies have been the product of intense racism and a misguided notion of preserving whiteness within the U.S. Of course, what constitutes white has changed over time. Over the years, U.S. border policing has produced some truly heinous initiatives, including one that just outright uses a racial slur, which I'd rather not repeat. These operations have resulted in everything from mass deportations, to exploitation of migrant workers, to the murder of people trying to enter the country. Border policing is a rapidly growing industry. In 1992, there were just over 4,000 Border Patrol agents. Today, that number stands at over 20,000, which, Vitale notes, makes it larger than the ATF, FBI, and DEA combined. One of the more egregious abuses of police power began as Operation Streamline in 2005. Thanks to a huge amount of new funding, Border Patrol launched an intense zero-tolerance capture and hold campaign. And, according to Vitale, over the ensuing 10 years, more than 400,000 immigrants were prosecuted for improper entry, and over 300,000 for the felony of re-entry. The US government has spent $7 billion on this approach, with much of the money going to private, for-profit prisons. So, in essence, the Border Patrol was tasked with arresting people trying to enter the country, then handing them off to for-profit prisons to fuel the private prison industry. In other words, profiting off of human misery. Vitale says, today there are 75,000 non-citizens in US prisons, about half of whom are there for immigration violations. Many are held in for-profit private prisons. ICE uses 46 such facilities to hold 70% of all immigration detainees, despite repeated reports of abuse, overcrowding, and inadequate medical services. The massive expansion of border policing has caused innumerable problems, among them the separation of immigrant families, a complete lack of accountability, the rapid militarization of border police, and wasteful spending on ineffective walls and drones. The whole thing is just one massive money sink with no real benefit, one that offers an outlet for the violent tendencies of American police. Vitale explains, the Border Patrol has never had any effective accountability mechanism. Since 2005, only 3 Border Patrol agents have faced indictments for excessive use of force, 2 from local prosecutors and 1 from the Department of Justice. 3 indictments in a sea of crimes against humanity. So, what do we do in the face of such an obviously broken system? Some have called for moderate reform and a return to something like the Bracero program, which implemented a system of foreign worker authorization, though others, Vitale included, assert that such programs were ineffective and insufficient. Instead, Vitale suggests we consider alternatives to wasteful and violent border policing. He says that most people would rather stay in their own cultural setting than migrate provided the opportunities are similar. Instead of spending tens of billions of dollars per year on border policing, we could open our borders and establish a mutually beneficial agreement to improve the lives of the poor in both Mexico and the southernmost portions of the US. Vitale cites the EU's policy of free movement, which improved conditions in poorer European countries without adversely affecting richer ones. Vitale then names several instances of the US invading or overthrowing countries in Southern and Central America, which has become something of a national pastime. Essentially, Vitale is making the point that perhaps the US is getting what's coming to it when it comes to things like refugee crises. After all, we've been destabilizing entire regions and creating those crises in the first place. If we want people to stop fleeing their countries, maybe we should stop overthrowing their governments, installing puppet dictators, and letting huge corporations exploit and torture their populations. Vitale concludes by saying, once we understand migration as a global process driven in large part by the policies of our own government, we in the United States should feel obligated to end those practices and open our doors to those fleeing them. We cannot and should not rely on ever more intensive, violent, and oppressive border policing to manage problems that we ourselves helped create.
Chapter 10, Political Policing. Vitale starts by explaining that, from a mainstream American lens, it is easy to see political policing in third world dictatorships. Death squads, disappearances, torture, strongmen, and all that. But the truth is, we have political policing right here in the good old US of A. Like the other chapters, Vitale gives a detailed history of political policing itself, starting with its origins way back in 1666. The number of the beast! When Louis XIV created the Lieutenant of Police to suppress riots and political movements, although they failed to predict the French Revolution. From here, Vitale talks about the political policing of anarchists in the United States in the early 1900s. This being the time of bomb-throwing anarchists and the assassination of President McKinley and all that, and the torture and arrest and deportation of thousands of suspected anarchists in this thing called the Palmer Raids in the 1920s. Vitale then discusses COINTELPRO and the FBI collecting files on, spying on, infiltrating, bombing, assassinating, and otherwise harassing and disrupting liberation, anti-war, and civil rights groups in the 1960s. Vitale then gives a history of Red Squads, police specifically tasked with dealing with socialists, unions, and workers' rights activists. But for this angle, we have to go back in time again, starting with the private security forces, such as the Pinkertons, killing and infiltrating and otherwise disrupting workers' organizations starting in the 1890s. But as Second Thought explained when covering Chapter 2, why pay private security to break up strikes when you can have taxpayer-funded police do it? As Vitale explains it, police were beholden to local elected officials who did much of the hiring and firing of police, especially at the top ranks. In many places in the 19th and early 20th centuries, police were directly appointed by local politicians on the basis of political service and substantial bribes. These local officials were often beholden to large employers through bribery and political favors. When these employers were faced with labor unrest, they need only call on local police to suppress the strike, break up meetings, and intimidate and brutalize alleged ringleaders. Basically, whether it's the FBI with COINTELPRO or the police and the Red Squads, political policing has a long and sordid history in the US, which exists to this day. For example, in 2010, the ACLU found hundreds of incidents of police spying on legal, political, and protest activity in 33 states since 2001. Reforms. Or, wait, there isn't a reforms section of this chapter, so... Okay, moving right along. Vitale then discusses joint terrorism task forces and fusion centers. Basically, two things focused on dealing with terrorism post 9/11. But due to the lack of terrorism within the US, they have transitioned to monitoring political activities such as the Occupy movement or Black Lives Matter or whatever.
A joint terrorist task force. Interesting name. You'd think they'd call it the Joint Anti-Terrorist Task Force or something, but they really actually engage in truth in advertising this time. They call it what it is.
Discussing fusion centers, Vitale states, in 2008, the ACLU of Massachusetts obtained a fusion center document on standard operating procedures that authorized surveillance and intelligence gathering of public meetings absent any connection to criminal behavior. Great, that's what we need. Awesome. Very cool free speech democracy we got going. Lastly, Vitale discusses entrapment and false arrest by the police. Basically, police jumping through all kinds of hoops to entrap people for terrorist activities. And he discusses the police as crowd control at protests, which is something I think we've seen way too much of as of late. Alternatives. One alternative Vitale discusses is to take the steam out of political movements by employing political solutions. Kind of like how the New Deal took the steam out of the labor movement, or how foreclosure forgiveness and student debt forgiveness could have potentially taken the steam out of the Occupy movement, or how restructuring the war on drugs or dramatically scaling back broken windows policing could have taken the steam out of the Black Lives Matter movement. Basically, giving into at least some of a protest movement's demands can really tamper the movement, so political leaders should, do that. And Vitale states, when normal political channels are closed off, street politics become more common. The other alternative is to demilitarize the police, give back the militarized weapons received under 1033. A program that allows police departments to get military-grade equipment, which they use for spying on political movements or walking around the streets during protests looking like a goddamn invading army. And Vitale concludes, we must also confront the role of U.S. domestic and foreign policy in producing political violence. The best way to avoid political violence is to enhance justice at home and abroad. I believe Second Thought and I both have discussed this subject at length, so I'd check that out if you want to know more. Conclusion. The concluding chapter of this text is, well, what has essentially been the conclusion of each chapter leading up to this point. Basically, as long as the function of the police remains the same, reforms will be ineffective, and many reforms will only further empower the police when we should be doing the opposite. What we need is to end broken windows policing, develop robust mental health care services, expand low-income housing, decriminalize sex work and recreational drug use, as we've done with gambling and alcohol, and use the money saved from decriminalization and the tax money gained from sales on treatment and health services for those who want it, and overall economic revitalization in general, because to truly address crime, we must improve people's economic conditions. Or, as Vitale states, decades of deindustrialization, racial discrimination in housing and employment, and growing income inequality have created pockets of intense poverty where jobs are scarce, public services inadequate, and crime and violence widespread. Even with intensive over-policing, people feel unsafe, and young people continue to use violence for predation and protection. Any program for reducing crime and enhancing social well-being, much less achieving racial justice, must address these conditions. In other words, and Vitale ends the text stating, we cannot demand that the police get rid of those annoying homeless people in the park or the threatening young people on the corner and simultaneously call for affordable housing and youth jobs, because the state is only offering the former and will deny us the latter every time. We should demand safety and security, but not at the hands of police. In the end, they rarely provide either. Conclusion. Now, I might be a punk rock, 1312, A-cab, F the police, fry bacon fry type pup, but there really isn't anything like that in this text. Sure, the content is intense with many graphic and heart-wrenching stories and statistics, and sure, the focus of the text is to argue for extreme limitation or even end to policing, but none of it is mean-spirited. This text is not a reprimand or condemnation of the police themselves. It is instead a very policy-based explanation of alternatives to the systemic use of policing for solving many of the societal problems facing the US today. This text isn't really a deep dive into any of the subjects named. Don't get me wrong, there are plenty of examples and studies and such to demonstrate the claims made, but the subjects of each chapter could easily be a sprawling book in their own right. But as an introduction to these ideas, this text does a terrific job. Looking at all the different ways police exist in our society, protection from violence, mental health intervention, homelessness, the war on drugs, civil unrest, etc., giving a brief history of the police regarding these subjects, explaining the consequences and use of police as a solution of these problems, explaining the benefits and shortcomings of various reforms, and finally explaining the true solution to these problems, the true alternative, that being the end of policing. If you want to know about the history of policing, the history of using police to address violence and mental health intervention and the war on drugs and various other subjects covered in the text. If you'd like to know how the police have failed to properly address these problems, and you want to know what true alternatives might be, then I highly recommend The End of Policing by Alex Vitale. And thank you again, Second Thought, for helping me tackle this text. And as always, I'd like to thank my wonderful patrons. Your tremendous support has allowed me to get dog insurance, which is wonderful. You've allowed me to support other creators I couldn't otherwise support, gotta love that. You've helped me get information out about a pretty relevant topic, which is great. And you provide me with extra funds for books and dog toys and things like that, which is really awesome. I appreciate you folks a lot. And if you like what I do here and you want to support the show, you can go to patreon.com/radicalreviewer. And if you're interested in radical theory, looking for a book recommendation or whatever, you can get your radical reviews here with the Radical Reviewer. Thanks for watching.
Well, you seem like a nice enough pooch, so I'll let you off this time with a warning. But listen, I catch you around here again, I want to run over you myself. Have a nice day.